So in today's video, we're going to be talking about Cuban false chameleons' diet. Basically what they eat, how much they should eat, this and that. Anyways, roll the intro. So me and Goliath are going to tell you about their primary diet. Now in the wild, these big old guys are going to be, hey buddy, you gonna jump? We'll be eating mostly snails. Now, when it comes to snails, you want to obviously try to feed them a captive bred specimen, or you could have a whole bunch of issues like, parasites, anything that was on the snail outside, like any pesticides. Well, if he eats that, he'll have those in him, and those are not good to have, especially inside that big old belly. But if you're going to do that, you want to avoid that. But if you do grab some from outside, about 3 generations into your project, they should be healthy enough to feed. Obviously, call off any individuals who have any obvious issues.
Sorry I didn't get to talk about snails' protein count and other things that make them up, so this part is here to fix that.
So for 100 grams of snails, it is about 90 calories. The macronutrient breakdown is 9% carbs, 15% fat, and 76% protein.
And thanks to the shell that they will eat a bit of during feeding, they're going to be gaining the benefits of extra calcium, extra proteins from the shell, and probably the most overlooked being concholin. That the most common way of getting snails as food for our reptiles lacks, which we're about to talk about.
Then there are canned snails. Canned snails will be your most likely option. The issue with canned snails is that, well, at least my guys, and from most people's understanding, they don't seem to enjoy them that much. So if you're going to offer them, be ready to know that they probably won't eat them. Your feeders will most likely end up eating them. But the most efficient and most intelligent option is obviously just grabbing ram horn snails. These are aquatic species of snails. Now the thing with them, these are everywhere. I'm talking they're at your pet shops, Petco's, they're at your mom and pop shops. Pet keepers have them. I have them. I used to. But pretty much, if you have a fish tank, just throw a couple in there. They're going to, one, help your fish tank's bio blah 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 blah. I haven't been in fish in a couple of years, forgive me guys. And on top of that, they're gonna breed like crazy. Just throw food in there. They're gonna eat the fish poop, the fish food, their own food, because you're gonna have to feed them obviously, but they're gonna eat a lot and they breed like crazy. So you can feed some to him, or if you're another breeder, you can feed them to the kids. I had to swap out the Cuban, show off one of my other girls. Goliath's back there now. But, if you're going to be feeding these guys, we're obviously going to be feeding them a lot of insects. Now, in captivity, the most common insects will be crickets. Crickets are good, so we're going to talk about them first. Crickets are really good. Why is that? It's because crickets are rich in protein and all these other things that, well, make these animals big, fat, and happy and grow. But, the downside of crickets is that to reach the appropriate minimum it would come from feeding a roach is that, you have to feed more. Luckily, crickets are very cheap, and once you figure out how to breed them, they are extremely plentiful. Let me move my hair. Extremely plentiful. But if you can do that, kudos to you. I have bad luck breeding crickets. I typically can get them going, and then I always have something come up like a spider, gets in there, and just eats everyone, and I have to go buy crickets outside of the schedule, which then means I have to go drive somewhere that I didn't feel like driving to that week. But yeah. Now, another option, which is what I far more prefer, is roaches. Roaches are amazing feeders. Now, the most common roach you're going to find will be dubia roaches. If you're in Florida, you have your orange head roaches. Now, my knowledge, orange heads are just pretty much everything a dubia is, but they're bigger, bigger. But if you do that, that's you. I personally don't have them because, I don't have a need to. I'm not in a state that banned dubia roaches. And they're basically identical in all the other stuff. Mine is a couple micro differences in size. But, dubia roaches are very efficient feeders. That's because they are almost as common to find as crickets, which helps a lot in that factor. Now, the other thing with dubia roaches is that they breed very quickly. So if you start up a colony, they're going to breed very well for you. And they're very rich in protein. Now, let me talk to you about a roach that puts dubia roaches to shame. And the dubia roach only has one thing over them, which is size, which is the red runner roaches. These roaches are richer in protein. They breed far much more. They are extremely more prolific. They live just as long, I believe longer. And on top of that, they reach adulthood, aka breeding age, very quickly. Only real downside, like I mentioned earlier, a dubia roach gets about yay big, or a red runner gets yay big, that wide, where a dubia is that wide. but it is the perfect size for an adult Cuban false chameleon. Remember the rule, if it fits between the eyes, you're good to go. That's all lizards, by the way, besides specific things. They can go a little bigger than most reptiles because they roll their food and crush it and tear it up because they eat snails. So that's always nice. So you can feed them the actually big adult dubia. But if you feed on that, they don't want to eat as much in my experience. So you want to tend to be a little smaller on the more appropriate sizing with that. But yeah, what do you think? But another primary feeder I want to talk about would be silkworms. Silkworms, my guys and girls in the audience, are elite. These feeders are rich in protein, they're rich in hydration, they're rich in everything. The only downside of these things is that they don't breed that often because they're a worm that turns into a moth, and they are not that extremely prolific, and they're somewhat kind of annoying to breed for anyone who doesn't have very specific things. There's probably a way around that, but I haven't done my digging because I'm content with just buying them here and there. I can tell you though, every reptile I fed, especially these guys and my other large anoles, they love silkworms. Maybe I'm gonna do an order soon. We can do another feeding video of silkies. They seem to love them. Now, I'd also like to talk about grasshoppers. These are truly the final thing I would consider in the primary feeder. A couple niche things I don't know about or just don't remember to recall in this video. But American bird grasshoppers will probably be your best bet when it comes to grasshoppers. One, they're obviously a U.S. native, so anyone in the U.S., they are kind of easy to get. Two, these guys breed prolifically from the start of the year to the very end of the year if you keep them a little warm with some good humidity. Remember that. Only kind of downside is that they do get fairly large, and the grasshoppers are somewhat annoying to get breeding and very loud. But if you're willing to do grasshoppers, they're extremely rich in protein and all the other good stuff. But what do you think about them? Real quick, before we go into talking about our secondary feeders, which is going to be mostly feeders that are fat, very fatty feeders versus very high in protein like the primary feeders. But there is something that's kind of outside those realms, but are very important to the Cuban false diet if thrown in there, which would be fruits, isopods, and crested gecko diet. We're going to talk about crested gecko diet first. Now, crested gecko diet is good for them for the same reason fruits are good for them that we're going to talk about soon. But, you know, the good thing with crested gecko diet is that you can buy a bag and put it on a shelf. It's dry. It's a dry good. It essentially won't expire in any time frame you're going to own it if you're feeding it off to your animals. And what's going to happen is you're going to mix it up, do all this stuff. I'm pretty sure all y'all know how to make crested gecko diet, and they'll eat it. But that's good and dandy. That's all good and fun and games and all, but if you're gonna feed a real fruit, you know, you could do that and they will eat it. The only issue with that is that they seem to enjoy sugary fruits, which, I mean, they have a sweet tooth. We all have a sweet tooth at the end of the day. They're gonna eat something that isn't exactly healthy for them, which is the issue here, because we don't want them to get addicted to something or turn down this food option because they think they're gonna get the unhealthy option. So, you know, when it comes to feeding fruits, try not to be super sugary in the thing, and remember, they don't eat fruits every day in the wild, nor do they eat them every week. And they maybe eat them once, maybe 3 times in a month if they're lucky. But, you know, guess what, guys? isopods are pretty good, pretty interesting things. But if you're gonna feed them, guess what? There's one issue, is that they're not yay big, they're not yay big, they're yay big. They're teeny tiny little things. And a false chameleon, well, you've been seeing them on my shoulder and head in part of this video. They're pretty big. So that's pretty impractical. But for younger animals, it's amazing for them. It gives them that calcium boost they need when they're growing up, and it's great. But if you keep your adults in a bioactive enclosure, they will eat an isopod. They will. Now, there's one thing we're going to talk about is the hornworm. Now, the hornworm is also kind of awkward because they're not really a secondary feeder, but they're not a primary feeder because they don't excel in any of the protein counts, nor is their protein count really bad or is their fat content that high. But they have a lot of water. Now, if you know anything about a false chameleon, we're going to go over this a bit more later, is that they really do enjoy water and having a lot of access to it. So, feeding your guys a hornworm a little bit, it's pretty good. My friends of watching this video, y'all have made it far enough to reach the secondary feeders. This part, we're going to be talking about mostly feeder insects that actually have a higher fat count than protein, and that's where they excel at, their fat content. Which isn't bad when it comes for feeding, but it's not something you want to do every time, hence why they're like a secondary feeder. You know, you can offer them, it's not bad 100%, but in large amount of quantities or a very, 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 very consistent basis, it can be, you know, an issue down the road. But we're gonna start this out with possibly the most healthiest of these secondary feeders, which is the black soldier fly larva. These guys are pretty decent in their protein count, but they have some pretty large fat reserves along with, you know, some other stuff as you're seeing on the screen. But they're really good. Most of every anole I've fed here, especially the false chameleons behind me, seem to enjoy them, so that is a plus. Only big issue, honestly, with these feeders is when you, well, buy a couple hundred and you forget to close the lid and they start morphing out into little flies that look like wasps. And you purge them. But yeah, you know, they're interesting, they're cool, they're okay secondary feeders. But now we're going to talk about pretty much the cheeseburger, if you will, of secondary feeders, which would be the waxworm. It's the protein contents of a waxworm along with the moisture and this and that. These are pretty interesting things, but you know what we're here for in the secondary feeder category, which is the fat content. But as you know, superworms, they have higher protein counts, fat reserves, moistures, and all the other stuff. The thing is with a superworm is that they do get to a much more larger size, which is a lot more comparable to the adults. That's personally where I see they're more of a use over a mealworm. But going into the mealworms is that, well, they fill honestly the same niche, but meant for, in my opinion, smaller animals, juveniles, or babies, if you're going to feed them here and there as the occasional little treat, essentially. But they do have slight differences in their protein, their moisture, most importantly in this category, fat. Yeah. Real quick, we're going to go over why your false chameleon isn't eating and how to fix it. So, let's talk about stress. Now, your false chameleons will actually react to stress. Believe it or not, these guys do not tolerate handling all the time. So it's important to give your guys a moment of peace and quiet where they just get to chill, hang out, and do their own thing. They like us, they tolerate us pretty well, very well actually, considering they're a anole. But they do need their moments of peace and happiness. Simple way to fix that is just to let them be, and there is plenty of times I've seen this with babies, especially the babies, mind you, when the people are just like, whoa, all with them, and they just back up a little bit and let the animal breathe, let you breathe, just everyone relax, and the animal within the next day, like that, just starts going to chow town on anything they throw in there. I've had a couple babies, especially when they come out, they hate me, and then I'm like, hey, okay, boop, and then I leave them alone and they grow quick because all they get to do is focus on eating and not worry about Then another thing could actually be related to supplementation. Now, supplementation is pretty important with these animals. Now, obviously, you're going to be giving them UVB bulbs, so you don't need to be giving them D3 with their calcium all the time. But do you still should do it? Yeah.
Hey, it's editing Cameron. Just wanted to clarify this because the original part was a little hectic to understand. It would have been chaos editing it, trying to make it make sense. So, if you're going to be dusting them with calcium D3, I do recommend only dusting them about 2 out of the 3 feedings, because you're going to be feeding them every 2 to 3 days, and you don't want to give them too much of the D3 because they're getting that already from the UVB. But when it comes to the dusting them with the calcium with no D3, dust with all of them, but what I do recommend far more is only dust 2 of the feedings with calcium and no D3, but dust 1 of the feedings with a multivitamin that is particularly strong with vitamin A. If they have that one, it's going to boost their immune system, and it's going to help everything in the system just work a lot better for the animal, and they're going to be a lot more healthy and more willing to want to eat, because a healthy animal is one that wants to eat and just do them. UVA is pretty important. Why is that? It's because UVA is essentially what we talked about a bit with the vitamin supplication with the vitamin A, but it's in bulb form. Yeah. But pretty much what you're going to do with that is look at your heat bulbs. Most of them actually will have it in our modern day, being 2025. In the last couple of years, it's been pretty common. Check still. There's some brands that don't do this, and it's kind of dumb. But what you're going to do is when it's in the light, it's going to hit the animal while they're basking. And what this is going to do is it's going to boost their color. It's going to help with the immune system. It's also going to help with their natural responses, like wanting to do natural behaviors that each individual species will like to show off and do. For example, with these, you're going to see a lot more dewlap displays, a lot more just head bobbing, etc., etc.
And also, you're going to see a lot more increase in wanting to breed if you're also trying to reproduce the species. And you're going to see a lot better connection with them being able to recognize food and wanting to actually eat it, which is great. That's really important. Now you know what it is and how to use it properly. Yeah, now those are the primary reasons of why a false chameleon will not be eating for most people. But, you know, if I wanted to cover all of them, this video would be literally hours long and no one would watch it, which means all this information is pointless because no one would want to even listen to it. But if you have any weird situations with your animal not wanting to eat, drop a comment. I will give you the best of my capabilities to help answer that question. Granted, remember, I'm not a vet and I don't know everything. I'm smart, especially with them. But I'm not a super genius. Genius though. Now when it comes to false chameleons, these animals can be somewhat awkward to know if they're skinny or fat, especially to newer keepers with the species or people who don't work with them. As you see, these somewhat I would call hip dips. At least that's what I call them. I don't know what to call them. I mean, it's a piece of their bone that sticks out a little bit. This is a normal feature of the animal. But what I would say isn't normal is when they're essentially what I would say like two eyes of a skull sink in, and that's a good indicator that they're underweight and not eating the proper amount. As you see with the Goliath, his aren't sunken in, the hips are out, oh, and he jumped. Yeah, but that's how you'll know. Interesting, yeah? Now, when it comes to false chameleons, as you know, obviously different stages of life require different amounts of food and how much and often and all the cool stuff. So when it comes to a big grown man like Goliath here, we want to be feeding him about every 2 to 3 days so he can maintain a healthy body weight and still get his nutritious and all that cool stuff. Wow, I'm looking at the twig and old puff out the dewlap right now. That's really cool. But right now, you know, do that every 2 to 3 days. Same with the females. Feed them a little bit more if they're going to eat, obviously, because they're going to be laying eggs if you're breeding them. If they're not, just feed them more. They will lay slugs occasionally, so you do want to stay on top of them a little bit more. When they're a fresh hatchling, like say one you would buy from me or any other breeder, you want to stay on top of feeding them about daily. But when it comes down to the lovely individuals who are getting older, like subadults, maybe to late juveniles, you can move into the 2-day feeding period. Now, pretty much in this video, we went over numerous topics, you know, how to tell if your false chameleon is skinny, how to, you know, what kind of foods to feed them, etc., etc. But I hope that y'all at home learned a lot about your lovely little scaly twigs at home, and, you know, maybe consider buying a false chameleon from me. So with all this information, I hope that all of y'all get to learn something and provide better care for your animals so they can be with us as long as possible, because these little guys are angels, I tell you, absolute angels. Anyways, into the video. If you have a couple spare minutes or want to do something later, watch the rest of the playlist. Or if you're interested in that twig anole, which is basically just a smaller Cuban false chameleon and a couple other differences, you can watch maybe their video. I don't know. But yeah, into the video, actually.